The online colleagues that have joined us, thank you so much for staying with us. As we said, we are on the day 2 of the Winter School Public, always say Winter School, Public Economics Conference. We are beaming live from the Midland Visual Production Studios. That's where we are, and we apologize for the glitch that we experience. Our team is working around the clock to ensure that it does not continue or get worse than what it is. But thank you so much for staying with us. We appreciate it. You being there means a lot for us, and the number of you that experience glitches and you keep on going with us. And for that, we do appreciate it. Well, I'm not alone. As I said, I'm with my colleague, Veli, who's just going to quickly introduce himself, give you a bit of a rundown what we expect today. Andrew is standing by to give us a session.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Good morning to our audiences online. So today is quite exciting. It's all about spending reviews and the specific case studies that have been done over the years. We also have Andrew on standby, who's going to start us off on the masterclass on program evaluations. How do we do these evaluations? What action steps do you take? And most importantly, I think, what are some of the key lessons that we could take away from these evaluations? We also have very focused content sessions focusing on the case studies. There are a number of officials within government, because the beautiful thing about spending reviews, GTAC has capacitated people to know how to collect the data, how to process, how to analyze, and most importantly, how to present your findings. So people will be interested to find out some of the spending reviews that have been done. We also have, I think, some key issues that we must highlight, especially around the online session as well. So we just want to caution everyone that whenever the session comes to an end, there will be another session. So just please remember to exit the session at the end and then join another one, because it does sometimes cause that bit of a delay. And most importantly, your questions, your comments are really much appreciated by the speakers, by the presenters, because it shows that you have engaged. It also shows that you were listening.
Exactly.
I think Prof spoke about active listening yesterday. So it's quite really important. So yes, I think with that being said, Vusi, yeah, we really have an exciting lineup today, and I'm looking forward to it.
Definitely looking forward to it. Those were the outline of what we're looking for today, as well as some visual articles that you need to look. Let us know that you are there from time to time. If you like a point, a sharp will do, a heart will do, a thumbs up will do. That keeps us going, knowing that you are still there with us and still well connected there. Thank you. And as he said, when sessions end, they will be jumping from one session to the other. We don't leave the entire platform. All right. Andrew is on stage with us. He was here yesterday giving very interesting views on taxes, and today he comes and a different theme or topic that he'll be talking to us. Most of you probably heard when we introduced Andrew, and some of you may not be here, or you were not probably here yesterday online or in person. But just a bit about Andrew before he comes on stage. I'll tell you now that he joined the public service Department of Finance in 1993. That's right. That's some of us maybe were, I'm not sure what, but that's 1993. And in 2001, Andrew was appointed the Deputy Director General with the responsibility for the Budget Office and Public Finance in the National Treasury. His work covered spending policies, social development, and reforms of the budget processes and budget documentation. He contributed to the work of the CATS Commission on Tax Policy, served on the Committee of Inquiry into the National Health Insurance System, and was a member of the team that drafted the 1996 macroeconomic strategy and served in the interdepartmental task team on social security and retirement reform. So we are blessed by someone that has been on the system for quite some time. Ladies and gentlemen, online, this is what I'll need from you. Sharps for Andrew as he comes on stage. But in person, those that are here, please be on your feet and help me welcome Andrew Donaldson.
On the things that we got wrong and that we could have done better. And of course, as we all know, employment creation is one of those things. We have more or less the highest unemployment rate in the world, and this conference is focused on that theme. Stephen Friedman chided us yesterday for focusing narrowly on employment and work, and said he prefers to think about livelihoods, and I think there's a lot to be said for that perspective. I'm not going to do very much with that distinction, but bear in mind that we're not just talking about formal work, we're talking about many different kinds of employment, many different kinds of contributions to household well-being. Livelihoods is a category that perhaps captures that broader concept well. Yesterday, we started with the big picture on the fiscal situation, the fiscal context, the really difficult trade-offs and choices that government faces in these circumstances of low growth. We looked at revenue issues. We also looked at the big picture issues of the energy transition that the planet has to go through, that South Africa plays a part in and has committed itself to, and some really scary big numbers of the levels of investment that are needed in this transition, but also a reminder of how work opportunities, livelihood opportunities, changing conditions in communities, particularly in those affected by this transition. Think about Mpumalanga and its coal fields. These need to be issues in our policy framework. Today, we're looking at employment programs, and you look at some of the experience of the Jobs Fund, started over a decade ago, that has now put funding, government funding, into 160 or so projects, and we've learned some huge lessons about how one can go about partnerships between the public sector and government, partnerships between different organs of state, municipalities, NGOs, national departments, in addressing employment, creating employment opportunities. And we're also going to look at some of these wonderful spending reviews that have been conducted. And we had a really interesting presentation discussion this morning between Mbali and Renette on this spending review methodology. It's been called a masterclass in the program, but it's really just my little reflection on some ideas in economic thought that go back 50 years or so, that have certainly informed how I think about employment policy and how I think about how one should evaluate and learn the lessons from reviews of spending, reviews of government programs and policies, and projects that have been implemented and how they've worked out in the context of what I'm calling a labor surplus economy. But that's the language of economic analysts thinking about these things in a development context 40 or 50 years ago. I'm going to take you back to some of the ideas that informed the project appraisal methodology popularized by the World Bank in the 1970s and 80s, adapted in various ways in many countries, often thought about as cost-benefit appraisal, cost-benefit evaluation. And I'm going to use some of those ideas to suggest some of how some ways of thinking about both evaluating projects and thinking about policies in our context of very high unemployment. So there's an outline of what I'm going to go through, a bit of a few words on employment as a policy objective and how it's not the only policy objective, and so one has to think about its relationship to other goals of policy, like adapting to climate change, which we talked about yesterday, like the challenge of increasing investment in an economy that is not investing sufficiently. I'm going to talk about, as I've said, some of the ideas in development economics that help us think about employment. And I'm going to talk about what that might mean in our context of reassessing policies and programs in a context when government has limited resources, but where we undoubtedly have a huge employment challenge to face. On employment as a policy objective, well, we had the minister yesterday in his opening remarks say exactly this. This government is committed to the challenge of beating back unemployment. I guess if I think back on our experience of the last 25 years, I'm not so sure that I really believe that still. because we've been ineffective in many of our employment challenges, and often in policy making, initiatives focused on employment seem to have taken a back seat, perhaps have not attracted the kind of resources that they need. And I was reminded of this when I picked up off my bookshelf the other day a copy of a book that was edited by Stephen Gelb. Some of you may remember his work on the South African economic crisis, and a publication in 1991, just before the change of government, in which a chapter on the unemployment crisis, and this was 30 years ago, written by Dave Lewis, did a very interesting review of the employment performance of advanced economies over 20 or 30 years. And David Lewis, in that publication in 1991, came to the realization and wrote about how only countries that really have a serious strategic commitment to full employment, or something approaching full employment, economists think of an unemployment rate of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% as consistent with full employment. You don't get 100% employment. Only countries which have policies that are geared towards a high level, cross-cutting commitment to full employment actually achieve that. And he does that stage comparisons between the Anglo-American and the UK tradition and European economies in drawing that conclusion. And I think that, and Dave Lewis has an interesting comment there, he went on to chair our Labour Market Commission report. Our Labour Market Commission in the 1990s investigated some aspects of employment creation, but in the end, on balance, I think it's fair to say that its emphasis is more on labour protection and labour rights, and growing the sort of advanced sectors of our economy than on broadening employment and participation in the economy. So I'm not sure we've really had the full commitment at a strategic and political level to employment creation that we need. I think that's a high-level policy issue. I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about, if you like, a narrower focus on evaluation of policy. But it is important to remember that there are a range of policies to consider. Sometimes there are trade-offs, and yesterday we thought we heard Michael particularly, but others talking about, in some sense, the trade-offs, the social choices that have to be made, difficult trade-offs in a context where investing in growth comes up against the constraints that the fiscus faces, limitations to tax raising, which we talked about later in the afternoon, limitations to spending, and indeed some very tough instructions that have gone out to provincial treasuries and departments just this week about their spending plans for the period ahead, and the implications of that for public service delivery. And in public policy, these choices between alternatives often are the things that capture the headlines, that make our lives difficult. But it's helpful to remember that in public policy and in social and economic development, there are also important complementarities. There are things that one can invest money in that have secondary benefits for other objectives of policy. And there are three really big complementarities in a context such as ours. Employment creation as a public policy objective contributes also hugely to poverty reduction and over time to reducing inequality. And so in public policy making, it's often important to try to find the things that have joint outcomes. One of the most important kinds of joint outcomes that is available to us in the context of rebuilding, reconstructing a post-apartheid economy is that we have had such inadequate investment in urban residential areas, in housing, in the kinds of small business opportunities, trading opportunities that accompany well-designed townships and residential areas, public transport services, and so on. We've not invested enough in that kind of infrastructure. We've not invested enough in housing. And of course, we've seen just in the past week the very tragic consequences, the risks that one runs in an environment in which there's inadequate investment in, inadequate regulation of, inadequate attention given to housing and its development. So finding complementarities in public policy is an important part of policy design. One of the kinds of trade-offs, though, and although here there are some opportunities for complementarities as well, that has to be considered, is about the present and the future. And in the economic thinking that I'm going to take you to in a moment, that tension between investing in future capacity and potential of an economy is often seen as a trade-off against meeting needs in the present. And the reason in economic thought that that's seen as a trade-off is because it is conceptualized, it is simplified down in economic thinking, in think, for those of the economists in the audience, of a Cobb-Douglas production function, where capital and labor are traded off against each other, and the spending in the economy can either go into meeting consumption needs, that's the needs of the present, or investment, and that's about the needs of future generations. So we think of the choice, that balance between consumption and investment in an economy, or savings and consumption and in an economy, as a trade-off between the present and the future. But now think a bit more broadly about the policy choices that governments actually face, and think about investing in better housing. And I think you can see there that deep in this trade-off between investment meeting future needs, meeting the needs of future generations, and meeting the needs of the present generation, are some opportunities for choices that do both. And of course, investment in housing has very quick benefits for the communities in which that housing investment takes place, in addition to providing a stronger and deeper and better residential housing infrastructure base for the future. And so the trade-offs that we face in simple economic models often are more complex and actually involve complementarities that should be part of policy making in practice, when you're really thinking about the choices that are made between different things that money is spent on and the opportunities that they bring. Development in the financial sector also is about this. Yes, you can think about savings and the mobilization of savings for investment in industrial infrastructure and economic capacity, future training and expertise, research and development as investments, but you can also think of it as mobilizing the access to finance, microloans to small businesses, forms of finance that assist households in improving their own homes as investments that meet present needs while also assisting in building a stronger economy for the future. So that's the general point of this slide, and I'm finishing this little picture here with a reference to a very recent book by Acemoglu and Johnson called Power and Progress, which is a rather interesting high-level scan of the great social choices that we face today with the technological change associated with the fourth or fifth or whatever it is, industrial revolution, but against the perspective of 1,000 years of technological change. And Acemoglu and Robinson point out that societies have often made technological choices in the context of great innovation that have benefited the rich, benefited the dominant companies, benefited those who own land, and have had very limited benefits, or the benefits have spread more broadly only over very long periods of time through social choices. And they're pointing to how in our present context, where we are living through technological change, and the climate change related ones we talked about yesterday are part of those, but of course the big IT changes are so dominated by large single companies that it takes policy shifts to shift technology in ways that benefit people more broadly. And Acemoglu and Johnson's book, in some sense, is a challenge. It says we're at a risk of society making choices that continue to benefit the rich countries, the big companies, the dominant companies we all pay royalties to when we switch on our computers, at the expense of broader participation. But that societies can make choices to change that drift, to lean against the ways in which technological change is captured by the privileged and the powerful in societies. So it's a wonderful read and an interesting big perspective on something that I'm going to say something much narrower about, which is how we think about employment. And how we think about what I'm characterizing here as that broad challenge in policy we face of shifting the bias against the unemployed, but also against the future, which is about investment and is about the sense in which we are, and we can see it in our newspapers every day, underinvesting in maintaining the transport capacity, the freight generation capacity, the power generation capacity, the municipal infrastructure, and the housing resources, and many others that are the foundations, not just of well-being today, but also of prosperity in the future. So here's the idea. And this is really the single thought that I want to leave with you. Here are two quotes from two important contributors to this bit of economic theorizing that goes back, as you can see, 50 years or so. And the simple idea underlying both these quotes is that if there's unemployment in the economy, then thinking in economic resource terms, thinking in terms of opportunity cost, that idea that is right at the heart of the first few lectures in any Economics 101 course, the idea that if there are resources that are unemployed in an economy, then bringing those resources into the productive economy one way or another is at the extreme, at the limit, costless. If you're bringing unemployed resources into productive activity, opening up opportunities rather than closing down opportunities in an economy, you're not using up resources. There's no trade-off between the use of mineral resources, machinery and equipment, or in this context, people's skills and abilities, bringing those skills and abilities into productive activity. So if workers are unemployed, the economy foregoes less than the nominal wage in giving them full-time employment. And so that idea is at the center of what we call shadow pricing in project appraisal. The idea, and you can see the quote at the bottom, the idea that even though you're paying a wage, as you must, as a reward to or as a return to productive labor in an economy, if that labor was unemployed and had no realistic prospect of becoming employed in the economy, then the overall cost, the social cost, it's sometimes called, the economic cost, or in some of the project appraisal literature, the so-called accounting cost, is less than the wage that is actually being paid. Now, you can immediately say, well, that's all very well, but you've still got to find the money. And I will come to that in a moment. But that's an important point to recognize here, that this is about an economic appraisal and evaluation of what is worthwhile for an economy. It's not about how you pay for or meet the costs that need to be met over time. You do have to have a strategy, and you do have to have a plan for doing that as well. So that's a very simple idea. And it's an idea behind a concept that is sometimes thought of as obscure and a bit esoteric, academic, not really relevant to policymaking. And indeed, treasuries almost everywhere in the world, and I'll come back in a moment to this, think that this is just academic. It's a formula. It's a methodology that is set out in textbooks, but it's really hard to implement in practice. We don't know what these numbers actually are. There's no easy way of measuring them. And so we often just move on to ignore this perspective in actual policy and program planning and design. Now, I'm not going to try to explain all the analytics here. I'm just going to say that in the development of this theory and the important work here, this is an extract from Squire and van der Tack's economic analysis of projects, published in the mid-1970s as a World Bank publication. This was at the time World Bank methodology, and it's been adapted certainly in many ways over time in textbooks on cost-benefit evaluation, project appraisal, and the like. What that formula simply says is that the accounting wage, the shadow wage rate, the price that you should think the labor that's being brought into employment in a project, or the additional employment that's being generated through a policy intervention, the real cost of that to the economy is labor's foregone marginal product at accounting prices. That's W minus M adjusted there. W minus M is the wage rate that's actually paid minus the economic productivity of somebody not in employment. Now, I should pause here and say, many of you will recognize in the logic of this framework an idea that's associated with Harris and Todaro, their dual economy model of development. And the dual economy model of development says there's an agriculture sector and there's an industrial urban sector. Higher wages are paid in the urban industrial environment than in the rural area, but there's lots of surplus labor in the rural economy. You take workers out of the rural economy as they migrate into the towns and cities, and join firms as factories are invested in, development proceeds, industrialization proceeds, and they earn a much higher wage, but the opportunity cost is near zero because the rural economy has lots of surplus people and has no difficulty in continuing to expand its production despite the fact that there's been a migration of people out. So that's the difference between W and M there, the wage rate that's actually paid in the urban economy, and the earnings that's attributable to the marginal product of a worker in a rural area who migrates into the city. Well, I'm simply saying the logic of that is also applicable to an economy where it's not just an agricultural rural sector that one is thinking about, which is where, to get to some of the language of different literature of this time, is where the reserve army of the unemployed is located. They may be in the informal sector, they may be in township living space, they may be homeless people in cities, they may be on farms, underemployed, they may be underemployed and not unemployed, and to reflect back on Stephen Friedman's point yesterday, they may well be involved in some livelihood activities, and one shouldn't ignore those and ignore those opportunities, ignore the value of livelihood activities. So we don't assume that M is zero. One of these textbooks, the alternative is described as, well, you could spend your time fixing the roof of your house, which is a nice point to make if you're writing a textbook for a Washington Urban World Bank audience. It doesn't mean very much if you don't have a house. All right, so that's W minus M. That's the important part of this equation here, and that's the foregone output at border prices. Border prices, don't have to worry about that. That hardly applies in today's economy of flexible exchange rates, 1970s. Everything had to be adjusted for the distortions associated with fixed exchange rates. So that's a technicality that, if you like, is in the textbooks. It shouldn't really be a consideration of any significance in thinking about these ideas today. And then this adjustment here, a couple of factors, I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's basically an adjustment that takes the income distributional impact of the job creation that's associated with the project into account. And it simply is a way, in mathematical terms here, of recognizing that the social benefit of job creation at low wages, probably, that benefits the unemployed, is an entirely different thing from the social benefit of employment creation for skilled people for whom there is demand in the labor market. And broadly, you can assume that skilled labor markets are not in surplus in the same ways that unskilled and semi-skilled labor markets are. And so you make an adjustment to these wage rates for the distributional impact of the job creation that's made. You also make an adjustment. Again, this is the Forex cost of increased consumption that is taken into account. You make an adjustment in this sort of technical analysis for the fact that increased consumption, again, World Bank thinking in the 1970s, worry about balance of payments constraints, you make an adjustment for the increased imports associated with increased consumption, which may put pressure on the foreign exchange reserves of an economy and balance of payments. Again, the world today is one in which we don't worry quite so much about that as we otherwise would. And then there's this other bit of complicated arithmetic here that the techno-analysts in the 1970s said we should be thinking about, which is the benefits of leisure, and not just leisure as perceived, or the time that people prefer to have to themselves in the perception of those who are the benefits of job opportunities. Work, after all, is time-consuming and expensive and costly, unpleasant. Often, I'm being told I've got 5 minutes left, which is fine. And so there's a socially adjusted, reduced leisure factor. Now, I'm putting this up here to say, don't be put off by the analytical complexities of this kind of work when it's really done rigorously for international academic publications. It nonetheless has an underlying logic to it that should apply to our thinking about almost everything that government does. All right. Distributional considerations are hugely important. Different shadow wage adjustments apply to different skills, levels, regions, sectors. Indeed, if an economy such as ours is resource constrained in its high-level expertise, in its engineering capacity, in its professional and managerial capacity, then it may well be that the appropriate shadow wage is higher than the nominal wage that is actually paid. Doesn't mean you need to pay the wages that professional engineers might earn on European or American markets or not. If you can create an environment in which living conditions are attractive, in which job security is sufficient, in which pensions are assured, and if you can manage professional earnings levels in ways that keep the costs of skilled labor lower, so much the better. But nonetheless, the economic opportunity cost of high-skilled labor may well be substantially higher than the actual wage rate. I once listened to Aaron Motsoaledi as the Minister of Health talking to an audience of skeptical medical specialists who said to him, well, your national health insurance ideas, you clearly are wanting, we're scared you're going to take our jobs, we're not going to have our jobs anymore, you're going to try to pay us less than we're earning now, and so we're going to emigrate and we're worried about the future. And Minister Motsoaledi's response was, well, of course, I'm the Minister of Health. I want to pay you as little as possible. But I nonetheless recognize that that I need to attract you. I need to retain your skills as part of our health system. And that's the right way to think about these things. Although implementation, of course, is never straightforward. So poverty and inequality as complementary benefits of rising employment. I've made that point already. Wage protection and basic labor standards may well raise the cost of employment. In our economy, uncertainty about the future, uncertainty about future growth of businesses. Many business people will say, well, we're very we're cautious about expanding employment because we don't know whether we're going to be able to afford to continue to pay people. We're also concerned about the costs associated with labor market rights and so on. Well, what this analysis says is, though that protection of workers, that assurance of minimum wages, that assurance of minimum standards of labor certainly can't be politically wished away. It doesn't clearly make sense for unionized workers in a context where unemployment is 30 or 40% to accept that the job market can become more flexible because there aren't job opportunities out there. It's a paradox of labor policy everywhere in the world. If you have high unemployment, workers are going to be that much more protective of the security of their jobs. In the American economy, where unemployment is very low, you lose your job, you've got a good prospect of finding another job fairly quickly. Labor market flexibility is much more acceptable. And so again, in the short run, to make the shadow wage point, the nominal cost of wages may well, be higher than the shadow wage, but recognize that when employment is created in businesses, businesses grow and stabilize over time. They see productivity improvements that lead over time to the possibility of wage increase. And of course, China over the last 20 or 30 years has been the huge, if you like, a lesson of economic history of how businesses paying low wages, becoming the factory of the world, over time see productivity improvements that have allowed wage rates in China and India, Southeast Asia, to rise hugely over the last 20 or 30 years as that learning by doing, learning through the experience of work has taken effect. Right, I need to finish off very quickly. Implications for evaluation. Now, I've been talking about a literature, a set of ideas in economic theory that has its origins in cost-benefit appraisal of projects. This is about the World Bank and its finances saying to themselves, if we're going to build a new dam in Tanzania, or if we're going to build a new road across, build a new highway or a new residential area or investment in a city, big new infrastructure projects, how do we evaluate them? How do we take into account the distortions in the economy or the existence of unemployment and the technological choices perhaps that exist in construction between machine-intensive and more labor-intensive production activities? So it's about what I've called here ex-ante evaluation of the cost-benefit feasibility of mainly infrastructure projects. And the lesson there, simple one: unskilled, semi-skilled labor should be costed for the purpose of these evaluations at below the wage that's actually paid. And the only point I'm really making in the context of the rest of today's discussions is that when we're evaluating programs and policies, evaluating spending activities of departments focused on housing, artisan training, land and rural development, this logic may also be an important part, should also be part of how we think about that evaluation process. But I'm going to leave it to those who do that work, who know much more about all those elements of spending reviews that Ronette and Bonnie were talking about earlier, and can perhaps think about how you bring this idea into those evaluations. Similarly, it seems to me that when we're assessing both in the decision-making phase, the investment decisions about jobs fund project, for example, or in the evaluations, the post facto reviews of what's been achieved, that logic that the actual cost associated with wages overstates the real cost to the economy of job creation should be part of the arithmetic, part of the calculus, part of the way of thinking about our assessment of those projects. I also think, and I make the point about skilled or scarce labor, probably more expensive, I think many policymakers think exactly the opposite. They think we're here wanting to create high-level jobs. We're wanting to create highly productive manufacturing and industrial activities that can pay wages that unions would like to see. But this analysis simply says the more we can do of that, the better, of course. But there's a far more limited case for public subsidization of, for taking into account the employment benefits of those kinds of investments or policies or programs in sectoral policy, for example, than in the case of programs that genuinely push out the frontier of employment, expand access to opportunities for work in the wider economy. And so I think that this logic doesn't just apply to small project evaluation of employment programs, for example. I think it also provides an underlying rationale for what I think about as a general wage subsidy built into the tax system, which I talked a bit about yesterday afternoon, and which is an essential feature of the social protection environment of many countries. I think we should be thinking about a general wage subsidy in part because of the logic of the social benefit of job creation and work opportunities being considerably higher than the cost associated with supporting or subsidizing that work. Now, I said I'd come back to the question of how things get paid for. The first point to make simply is shadow pricing, as it's conceptualized in the literature, is just about evaluating whether investments should be made or not, or more realistically, about the choice between different projects. And so when a government department or an agency, my time is up, is thinking about the award of tenders, for example, it might take into account that a more labor-intensive outcome, if you like, this is the logic of the EPWP's policy framework as it applies in areas like road construction and infrastructure and municipal development. It should take into account that the benefits associated with employment creation can be a factor that is incorporated into procurement decisions. And that's a fairly straightforward way of making that that adjustment to procurement decisions or sectoral policy, and sometimes to how costs are shared between the state subsidizing programs that ultimately belong to businesses or NGOs or independent organizers, such as many of the projects and programs that the Jobs Fund has supported over the years. That gets back to that large Acemoglu and Johnson point about technology choice. And I'm saying that in the developing context, in the context of a labor surplus economy, this is not what Acemoglu and Johnson's book is about. But if you take that logic and apply it to our context, then it has the implication that its impacts on employment that should particularly be a supplementary factor taken into account in procurement decisions and spending programs, and in sectoral policies. Think agriculture, in how it prioritizes what kinds of farming, what kinds of industries to support or not. And of course, I think that if you really think through how our BEE and preferential procurement policies work, this broad employment aspect is not missing, but it is often a lower priority than many than other elements in our procurement policy framework. And that's my last point then about the tax and spending system. There's no way of escape from the fact that if you, as a matter of public policy, intend to promote employment, fiscal resources need to be mobilized in order to do that, which is partly why I'm interested in that income distribution that I talked about yesterday afternoon, and why it's important to retain a progressive tax structure which does a fair amount of redistribution of incomes and opportunities from higher end earners and can contribute to financing employment programs, and not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And that, I've taken a little longer than I should have, is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And for those of you who are wondering whether we're going to take questions or not, the beauty is that there is actually a session where we're going to decode some of the complexities that Andrew has spoken about later in the afternoon. So please park your comments and questions for that session. But I'd also like our team to note the comments and questions that have been made in the chat, because I think you're sort of challenging a lot of existing assumptions, and a lot of economists are sort of asking questions. So let's please note those. One more time, let's please give a hand for Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to then get into the specific case studies on the spending reviews. You heard us earlier on talking about the different case studies. So the acting head of public employment and policy analysis, a unit in GTAC, Mbali Buthelezi, whom we all know, will take us through this session, and we're looking forward to listening to the key findings and the key insights of these specific projects that have been conducted. And I'll urge all of you, be prepared to listen. And I believe there's also going to be Q&As, but most importantly, games as well. So please be on the lookout. Over to you, Mbali.
Thank you so much, Veli. Good morning once again to everyone, those in person and those that are joining us from the AMEET platform. So we are shifting gears a little bit and moving to more the practicalities or the implementation of some of the theory that we've been discussing yesterday and a bit of this morning as well. So this session this morning, we'll be looking at 2 public employment programs. Well, the first one is actually more an overarching view of public employment programs. It was a spending review that was done by one of our LTAs, long-term advisors, Karen Haig. but also we'll be looking at the Presidential Employment Stimulus Program that is run by Ms. Kate Phillips. So I'll start with Karen Haig, who, as I've indicated, is our long-term advisor in GTAC. Karen has over 18 years experience providing strategic, technical, and operational support to government and some of the entities. Karen has been involved with GTAC actually for, I think, over a decade, if I'm not mistaken, in doing spending reviews with us. She is mainly our data analyst. She also does some research and project management. And in addition, she also did contribute to the development of some of our training materials in our initial phase, with the specific focus on the expenditure analysis, as well as the execution of spending reviews and the application of these spending reviews within the public departments or their own departments, provincially and nationally. So Karen will start with her presentation on the fiscal and institutional realities of South Africa's public employment programs. And really, this review looked at a selected number of public and community work programs, as well as the presidential employment initiatives that Kate will be speaking to a little bit in more detail. What we really did here was look at the scale of these public employment programs. We looked at their reach and how they actually contribute to poverty alleviation as intended by these public employment programs. And if you are listening quite clearly to Andrew's presentation, one of the points in the slides mentioned that poverty and inequality are complementary benefits of rising employment. And I'm hoping the discussion today will help shed some light on some of these. So without any waste of time, I'm going to hand over to you, Karen, to present on your spending review on the public employment programs. You have 20 minutes. And you know we have our timekeeper, Vusi, there, that has a very keen and firm eye on the watch. And the same applies to you, Kate. 20 minutes to present. I want to also open up for some discussions after that, and then we will wrap up. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Mvali. Well, lovely to be here in person today, and hopefully I can give a little bit of insight into public employment programs. And coming after the previous presentation, I'm an engineer, not an economist, so we've got the logic around it, or the approach you took in the spending review. We've tried to keep it quite simple and just get to try and understand some of the numbers. And Bali mentioned that typically, or one of the roles I've played in spending reviews over the last 10 years has been the data analysis. And so that, although that has been kind of tricky in this particular spending review. So that's a very complicated title for analysis of what we're looking at today, which is the public employment programs. And the last comment Andrew made was about shifting some of the funds that we have available in South Africa into public employment programs because of the benefits they can yield and around poverty reduction. And that's really what public employment programs are looking to do. They are, just to get us all on the same page in terms of context, these are programs that are not government officials. This is publicly funded programs, but they go to beneficiaries. These are citizens within our communities that are most at need. They have a purpose of employing people, and that social benefit comes through in that, because it is about providing money into people's pockets, but also providing that sort of a purpose and within communities some sort of role to give people a role within the communities that is meaningful. It is also the intent that these provide predictable source of funds for participants. And importantly, when we think about public employment programs, and we'll come to the numbers and evaluation of this later, but this is not necessarily work every day, but it's predictable. You know that if you within a program that maybe there's 2 days in every week where you're getting funds sometimes into a family unit, but that person can go, well, I know at least while I'm looking to transition, hopefully, into the active economy, that I've got this this money coming into the household that's predictable. I know what it's about. And so that's also around the social benefit. And then over time, there has been looking at this, it's about poverty reduction and social protection, but also we've got this idea of decent work. How can we match that gap to minimum salaries or wages and make sure that the working conditions are decent? So typically or theoretically, there are advantages of public employment programs, and this is, as I've mentioned, the creation of paid work for unemployed or underemployed members of society. Sometimes it's a complementary income, but in some South African case, often this is an only income for participants. The idea is that these programs can be highly flexible and can move into the environment quite quickly. Now, this is not always the case, but it is an intended benefit. I think programs have been running for a long time as the nature of any program, sort of have their own baggage, and then it's difficult to turn the ship. But then you've got others that through COVID, we saw a very quick response to some of the issues around loss of employment and the creation or placement of people into work opportunities. And I think, Kate, you'll speak to a bit of that specifically. Again, this idea of strengthening communities and building social capital. Yesterday, it was mentioned about if we're going to create these work opportunities, let's make these work opportunities worthwhile. Let's look at the green economy and the care industry. And through some of our public employment programs, we are already doing that. We think about programs that are working within the environment, within the education sector. So we already, those benefits are there. And I think sometimes in South Africa, we forget to applaud ourselves on things that we are getting right. And then the idea is that there is a possible pathway through these programs to employment or long-term employment. Now, this is a difficult one because we know that sometimes this isn't possible. And yesterday, someone mentioned that maybe one of the measures of success must be that transition to permanent employment. And you just mentioned that, the longer someone is within a environment, the productivity increases. So there is that benefit of duration, improved productivity. So we have a landscape to understand. Renette, in her opening comments of the discussion with Mbali this morning, said, when we started these spending reviews, we assumed people understood the landscape, that these programs or whatever was being assessed was fully understood. And what we've come to realize is that this is always a web to be unraveled and is a very key part. And so I just want to give a little bit of the landscape of support that's available. We have our public employment programs, and we're going to look at a few of the numbers with EPWP, the Expanded Public Works Program, Community Works Program that falls into that, and the Youth Initiative, as well as some of the economic employment stimulus programs. But this figure on the right here is saying, okay, well, there are different delivery channels. We've got EPWP that's on the one side, but we also have at the bottom here, there is some protection around the unemployment fund, not focusing on that. But on the top, there's social grants. This is all money into people's pockets in some way or form. And what we're looking at is the cluster in the middle, where there are these host of employment programs. Okay, so we're looking at four programs that are within the landscape. The Expanded Public Works program is to provide work opportunities, supporting the poor and underemployed through typically labor-intensive delivery of public and community assets and services. This is across 4 different sectors. Infrastructure, so think about routine roads maintenance. As an example, the environment, you've got your working for water and working for fire kind of opportunities. Social, which is more in the health and education space. And then the non-state, which really takes it into the CPW, community works sector. These have different targets. In the current phase, which is phase 4, so this program has been running in tranches for a while, this is looking at 5 million work opportunities. We'll come back to what a work opportunity is, because this is not 5 million people employed all the time. As I mentioned, these were points of employment within that are predictable. The community works program is more area-based, so we're talking about work within communities, it's targeting specific areas, and typically it's run at a more municipal level because it's within that area, whereas the EPWP is run through department level, so it's a bit a different structure. And then you get the Youth Employment Initiative. Here it's about linking, it's about placements of people into work opportunities. So making those linkages. And yesterday it was discussed that this doesn't happen automatically. There needs to be an intent behind matching people with skills or a particular function with the work that is available within the economy. And this is then targeted at youth. And I don't think we need to talk about why this is so important. And then there's the Presidential Employment Stimulus, where one of the programs under that is the Basic Education Employment Initiative, which is one of in the numbers we look at is where I've got some numbers there. This work was done or completed early last year. So the data, I'm hoping Kate will update some of the data, because this is a little while ago, but it does show some of the trajectories. So before we go into the numbers, we need to think about the performance. Spending reviews are about how much is spent, but then also what is the value of that? How is it performing against its intended objectives? And now it's very important to note that the public employment programs are structured to meet particular objectives. There's the youth, there's the, I've just been through the 4 different programs and what their purpose and their targets are. So is there value in standardization? And there's always value in looking at how one can make an assessment between programs or that have a similar intent. But I'd like to propose that we need to look at this with a broader set of measures, and look at that we need to understand that these PEPs each of them have a specific function, and that the nature and the type of sector that they are in determines the type of work opportunity. You might say to me, well, that seems fairly logical, but it is an important overarching comment that you're not comparing the same actual on the ground day-to-day activity. And so when we try and attribute value to that, we need to take that nuance into account. Then in terms of scale and reach, these are potentially interchangeable. And what are we trying to determine here? So there's sector expenditure. Some departments or some sectors have much bigger budgets than others. Their work is different, and then so there's potential to leverage on these in different ways. So in terms of scale, are we looking at just the number of work opportunities? We're looking at the number of participants getting money in their pocket. Are we looking at the amount of money that goes into the pocket? And then similarly, reach. Again, number of participants comes in, so there's a duality there. But then there's also the duration of this work opportunity. And we look at some indicators around short, medium, and long term, and what assessment can be done there. Cost, obviously, bottom line in accounting terms. Typically, we look at program overheads and then also money to participants. So how much is being spent on these, and who's getting the money, and is it being spent effectively and efficiently? And then there's the flow of funds. The structure of the programs can determine can have a very different impact on on the cost of the program. I think most importantly to note, which I haven't said already, is a program like the Expanded Public Works doesn't have a budget. There is no pot of money for the Expanded Public Works. It's leveraging on work that is to be done as part of those sectors anyway, and then how can we use that money to get it into participants' pockets, where are there other programs where there is a pot of money that then gets distributed, and so that does change the structure of programs. So, expenditure. And now, with 20 minutes, I don't have all the numbers up here. Just a few numbers to start you thinking. And I think, just to give a bit of the scale, the EPWP is looking at spending 15 to 20 billion per annum. This is across all sectors. This is not an insignificant amount of money. Remember, we're looking, which is about, what's that, 100 to 115 billion over 5 years. Remember, we're trying to create 5 million work opportunities there. And then when I was looking at this was still in phase 1 with the basic education employment initiative. Within a very short period of time, it was able to distribute 5 billion. That's about a third of what EPWP at that time was distributing. Not necessarily a directly fair comparison, because COVID had a massive impact on the distribution of funds into EPWP. But it is something to think about. How do these fund? How much funding is available to deploy into these programs? If there's a pot of money, where can it go? I think one of the most important things is this work opportunities. Now, work opportunity, because those are, well, let me just go through the definition. So it's defined as paid work created for an individual on a project for any period of time. So it is a little bit of number counting here, work opportunities. I know I've worked in the housing sector a bit, and we talk about housing opportunities, not housing. So, that we need to think about, but it is a good measure of saying, okay, if there's a project, how many opportunities are created? How do we count them? How do we measure it? Because if we can't measure things, we can't analyze it. What's interesting about the Expanded Public Works program is that it's fairly stable, and if anything, declining in terms of some of its contribution in terms of work opportunities. I'll expand on this a little bit more when we look at full-time equivalents in the next slide. The education initiative in its tranches is aiming at 300,000 opportunities. Again, considerable, and as I mentioned, that was quite being able to scale up quite quickly. So these numbers, again, not insignificant, but how do we grow them? How do we get from 300,000 to 600,000 in terms of work opportunities? Full-time equivalents. So when we're looking at measurements, I feel this is a better way to look at it, because a work opportunity, the duration of the project is variable. Whereas, okay, if we standardize it and look at it at 230 person days per year, that's a year of employment. So you're looking at a measure. The importance of this is that 5 million work opportunities from public works decreases down to 2 million full-time. No, sorry, that's over different time periods. If we look at the performance of the Expanded Public Works in the period 2015 to just before 2020, we're looking at 2 million full-time equivalents. And typically, if we analyze it now, the work opportunities may have been increasing, but the full-time equivalents have been decreasing. So the actual number of people employed, if we consider it as, if we try and look at it as full-time employment, is declining through this program. But what it does then allow us to do in terms of a spending review and measurement is look at the RAND value for a full-time equivalent. Now, again, apples for apples, I'm not sure. But what we can say is in the infrastructure sector, we've seen that they're quite expensive jobs to create. We're looking at about 100,000 rand for a full-time equivalent, whereas in the social sector, they can be much lower, 35 to 45,000. Well, that's what my analysis showed up, and so and even as low as 25,000. Now we're talking about that's per year. Got to think about what that money is used for. Are we looking at teachers assistants, or well, that's Kate's program, but programs, but some of the environmental programs. You know, infrastructure, is it because it's the goods and services or the skills, but it gives us this value for money consideration then we can look at. And coming back to my first overarching comment, the nature of the sector does determine this to some extent. Something that I haven't seen in the research I've done come up too often is the discussion around the duration of the work opportunity. And I think it's an element that we really can look into a bit more. Are we looking for something that is a month or 2, 3 months, and then people move through it? Or are we looking for something that's longer, up to a year? Where's that balance of bringing people into a program, possibly imparting skills, which some public employment programs have intent to do, and then and the hope is that we can transition them into the economy, right? So is there a sweet spot? Maybe per sector there's a sweet spot. I don't have the answer. I think we need some of the smart people in the room to continue thinking about this as an indicator, because I haven't seen this come up much as a, well, where's the value or the success? With these numbers, short is less than 30 days and long is more than 100 days. And if we look at the infrastructure sector, typically they're short. Social, typically they're much longer. And then some programs by design are, say, 3-4 months, and they're defined within the program. An elephant in the room: management overheads and the data that we use to make these evaluations. I'm going to say it upright. All these PEPs are managed in different ways, and they are not easy to define how they're managed. I think one of the problems or the issues with these programs is we're trying to get money out there, and we're not necessarily doing a good job of collecting the data and capturing it to share, to be analyzed. I found through the analysis that I did that we could contribute overheads, which are maybe conflated with some of the resources required to run the programs, somewhere between 2% and 10% of the project budgets. Now, what's good, what's bad? If 2%, I mean, you are transferring money outside the system. There's even transactions costs in that. 2% may only just be getting money through within a program. 10%, are you adding value? Are you monitoring quality? Are you improving quality? Are you creating the right structures to learn from, redevelop, pivot, things that aren't working? So it's one, okay, the data is really, really difficult to find and highly variable. There are some instances where it's where it is captured. But if we can't measure what we're doing, how can we improve? We need to make better decisions, and we need data for that. And we've got some smart ways now of doing that. This does not need that we can leverage on technology nowadays.
Karen, I'm ruining your flow here, but can you just...
Last few points. Okay.
Key highlights.
Yes. Okay. So contribution to employment program. I want to suggest that we absolutely have to continue with these public employment programs. I don't think that's a decision to be made. I think the issue is we need to decide where we must put our money, which ones are best for our current objectives. And I think yesterday came up in the afternoon is that we don't have a good mechanism within our government systems of prioritization. And I think that's one of the key things that is applicable to public employment programs, is if we have some extra money, if we can think of clever ways of using our budgets, where does the money go? Because I would argue there is, at the moment, there isn't one that's better than the other. There may be efficiencies that can be improved, but we need to look at the suite that is available there, address what our current critical needs are, how much money we have to channel into these, and then decide where the current focus is, and that this should not, and we should review that periodically so that the ones that are working well can scale up within that environment, because almost by definition, these are programs that ebb and flow and should be responding to the needs that we're currently facing.
Thank you so much, Karen. Can you please give Karen a round of applause? Yeah, Karen, you spoke to a lot of some of the challenges in the public employment program sector that I think I will want to debrief a little bit with you once Kate is also done with her presentation. And as you move to the podium, Kate, I just want to give everyone a brief synopsis of Kate. Kate is a development strategist, and she's working at the interface between social and economic policy, focused on issues of inequality as well as employment creation, which is well in line with the theme of this conference. Kate is currently the program lead for South Africa's Presidential Employment Stimulus Program, which has created publicly funded jobs and livelihood for over 1.2 million people since October 2020. On behalf of the presidency, she's also spearheaded the initial design process that led to the introduction of the Social Relief of Distress grant. So Kate, we're looking forward to hear what you have to say about the Presidential Employment Stimulus, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Is it on? Okay, thanks so much, and greetings to all of you here. So before we get into the detail of the Presidential Employment Stimulus, let's take just a brief step back and look at the impacts of unemployment on our society. And I think that we can all recognize these many different components of impact that are negatively affecting those directly affected, but also their households, their communities, and the society at large. So communities are paying the price at a local level with risks to social stability, because unemployment is often referred to as a tinderbox in our society. Should that tinder ignite, the impacts of that for the kind of growth that we need to create sustainable jobs is not a good one. So we face a vicious cycle in our context. And I think in this context, it's also important to understand why work matters. And work matters to people for a whole range of reasons. And of course, income is critical, but actually, it's about much more than the income. We know that participation in work builds all kinds of attributes and capabilities and competencies. And that the workplace, and that includes for people who are self-employed, the marketplace, provides access to networks outside of the home. It provides self-reliance and support to the household. Participation in work is part of the transition to adulthood. As a child, you are dependent, but very much part of how we're all socialized is that part of becoming an adult is to become self-reliant and to support others. And when that trajectory is stopped or truncated, it has very negative psychosocial impacts, very negative impacts on those affected. Economic participation is absolutely vital to both social and economic functioning. It builds teamwork, accountability, time management, creativity, management skills, collective organization skills, along with the many formal skills that are often more recognized. And we know that employment and participation in the economy of different kinds builds inclusion, it builds respect, it builds dignity. And without that participation, people who are unemployed often lack those things. They lack self-esteem. They feel that they have no value to the society. So these are critical parts of a functioning society, is that people are able to participate economically, feel included, be recognized. We know that unemployment erodes all of this. We know that the longer people are unemployed, the more unemployable they become. So those who've never worked may not gain these skills. But even for those who have worked, unemployment, it is recognized, erodes these skills. So lack of work experience is a fundamental obstacle for youth employment, where the private sector often says that they don't want to employ young people because they don't have work skills. So young people are trapped in a vicious cycle in which they can't get work because they've never had work. Often we are told, or the discourse is strong on the role of entrepreneurship and small enterprise development in addressing our challenge of unemployment. The research shows us that entrepreneurs without work experience are more likely to fail. If we want to build a cohort and a pipeline of successful entrepreneurs, they need work experience. But our economy is not providing work experience at the scale of need. And that's where part of the rationale for the social provision of employment. Similarly, formal skills that are not applied are lost. We invest hugely in skills development, but if people don't have the opportunity to apply those skills, that investment is lost. All of this reduces people's productivity, and at the scale at which we have unemployment, that low productivity is a systemic level problem. We have to turn it around, and in order to turn it around, we have to create employment, we have to create work, we have to give people work experience. That is critical to the rationale for the social provision of employment, which is what public employment is. So, breaking the cycle is part of creating the conditions, the enabling conditions for employment growth, for sustainable employment growth. Okay, so now onto the presidential employment stimulus. We had a crisis of unemployment before COVID, but COVID exacerbated it. And in the context of COVID, it was decided to launch the presidential employment stimulus. It was launched in October 2020 to take our public employment to new levels of scale. And we saw it as an opportunity to experiment with new levels of quality of work experience and quality of social value creation as well. What you will see here is that the focus was, yes, on jobs, it was also on livelihoods. So livelihoods were mentioned earlier. The presidential employment stimulus has supported both. In lockdown, there was also a focus on jobs retained, but that was just in the lockdown period. So yes, we have reached 1.2 beneficiaries in the period since October 20. That's the most rapid scale up of public employment that we've seen. And this is just a snapshot of the programs that are in operation in the last financial year. Since the inception of the program, there have been over 20 different programs supported. And just very brief, I'm going to go into some of these, but won't be able to go into all of them, and refer you to our website for those that I won't be able to cover. So let's go to the largest program in the portfolio. It's the Basic Education Employment Initiative, and I hope you all heard of it. And I often find people coming up to me and saying, I know so-and-so or so-and-so or so-and-so who is part of this program, because it is the single biggest youth employment program in the history of South Africa. Over 850,000 youth at this point have been placed since October 2020. It is an 8-month work experience extended by most provinces to 10 months. It's a high quality work experience, and the mentorship is often one-to-one with a teacher. It includes all skills levels. So general assistants are young people who have not completed matric. Teachers' assistants have to have matric, and graduates are prioritized. And young people are learning exactly the kinds of skills that the private sector say they need. They're learning time management, task management, communication, admin, IT, and much more. I think what is fascinating is the level of support that this program has from teachers and principals. 97 and 95% in the poorest schools. It's not often that teachers and principals all agree on anything this much, but there's huge support from within the schools for this program because of the value that it's adding. And here, what we see is that these programs are de-risking youth employment for the private sector. The private sector says, young people, we won't employ them because they're unemployable, because they have no work skills. We're acting as a circuit breaker in relation to that by providing valuable work experience and de-risking youth employment for the private sector so that absorption rates can increase. What is fascinating about the recruitment process, which is all done through sayouth.mobi, is that 1.5 million people applied for the 250,000 positions this year. So this program is actually having the effect of activating young people into the labor market. I won't go into all of the other details here because of time, but essentially we have right now 242,000 young people in 23,000 schools. What is remarkable about this program is its spatial equity. Inequality is a challenge at so many levels in our society. But what is amazing here is that every community in the country has a school, and all schools in the poorest areas of the country are participating in this program. So every community has youth jobs. These are Harambee maps. On the left is a representation of youth employment density without this program. On the right is youth employment density with the program. And what we see is that the program is able to provide youth employment in areas where no other opportunities exist. Now, the youth employment case for this program is very strong. What is emerging as equally strong is the social value creation agenda. What we're seeing is the program is assisting to move the dial on learning outcomes. So, Funda Wande is an organization who mentored school assistants in 120 schools in Limpopo. By term 3, grade 2 learners were 1.25 years ahead of their peers in control schools. Teachers' assistants can relieve the burden from teachers, support them, and help move the dial on learning outcomes, which is a critical issue for growth in our country. On Reading for Meaning, in the last cohort, 20,000 young people were trained on reading for meaning by organizations in the education sector specializing in this. On maths and science, the Siyavula Maths and Science Practice app is already in the schools, but they were having a problem that there wasn't great uptake. So this program recruited Siyavula Maths and Science champions. Now, these champions didn't have to be maths whizzes themselves. They did have to be able to complete the exercises on the app. But their function was to mobilize young people, to get participation, to organize group sessions, to get the energy around participating on the app. And right now, this month, there's a 1 million maths questions challenge in the schools, supported by the teachers' assistants, to get young people to answer 1 million maths questions. And because this is an app, we can directly track the impact of the teachers' assistants on getting young people to use the app, and we can track the improvement in performance. Right now, on phonics, Zandi is being rolled out in Limpopo in the Eastern Cape, where teachers' assistants are being used to move the dial on phonics. Now, if you don't know your alphabet, you can't read for meaning. So we have to start there because we're behind on those parameters as well. So I think what we see here is, on the one hand, there is the employment case. What we see here is the social value case and the impact that that social value can have on the conditions for growth. The program's also moving the dial on entrepreneurship, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but right now, 7 provinces are rolling out the Alan Gray Entrepreneurship Gaming app with teachers' assistants. These podcasts are being distributed, and we're seeing this program as a unique opportunity to get entrepreneurial education out into communities at a scale that currently doesn't exist in our SME ecosystem. I'm going to stop there and move to some of the other programs in the portfolio. In agriculture, over 175,000 production input vouchers have been issued to farmers. And this is wrong. It's not in this financial year. It's since inception. So please take that correction. Now, this program involved a lot of innovation because it was in the context of lockdown. And farmers had their value chains and their access to market and access to production disrupted by COVID. So the idea with this was to give support to subsistence farmers to get them back into production. It was a direct investment in increased productive output by subsistence farmers. And what was amazing about it is that for the very first time, the department used a USSD platform for the applications and for the issuing of the vouchers. Now, they were very worried about this because they thought, what about, will this exclude the most marginalized farmers if we use this USSD application on phones? In fact, it was the most marginalized farmers who loved it the most because they didn't have to get in a bakkie, drive 40 kilometers to the nearest government office, fill in a paper-based form, go home and never know whether their application was successful. They applied on their phones, they got the voucher on their phones, they were able to redeem them locally. What this did was provide the department with a geospatially located map of subsistence farmers and their production categories, which has improved their ability to provide support to the sector. Another key program is the Social Employment Fund. This has just completed its first year. It's now got 67,000 participants. It works with 35 implementing partners and over 1,000 community-based organizations. The key to this program is partnering with organizations beyond the state. So the schools program is a classic public employment program in the sense that it's delivered by public bodies, by the schools. This, however, is using public funds to support organizations in the wider society who are already doing all kinds of fabulous work at community level. I think the quote from the president sums it up. We're working on the premise that there's no shortage of work to be done to address the many social problems in our society. The aim is to support the considerable creativity, initiative, and institutional capabilities that exist in the wider society to engage people in work that serves the common good. The common good is defined broadly. Here is an example. Through this program, 2,600 sisterhood advocates have been trained as paralegals in 150 communities. They say that before the Social Employment Fund, they were able to process just 390 cases on gender-based violence per month. With this program, they are now processing 6,000 cases a month on gender-based violence and have reached over 25,000 survivors of gender-based violence. And again, this is an example of how we can create employment, we can create work, we can unlock the social value of labor through these programs in ways that address some of the challenges in our society. There are many other forms of work in this program. There's a lot of work in the food security space. Here's an example of linking up with the private sector, doing recycling. There's a lot on early childhood development. This story is, during lockdown, this young man started a reading club with one book sitting on a pavement in an informal settlement. Through this program, this has now become a mobile library with baskets of books on those yellow bicycles throughout informal settlements around Vrygrond, where this began, involving a large number of youth in the process. Karen mentioned weaknesses of systems. We have fabulous systems. The Social Employment Fund has actually taken reporting to new levels. They use biometrics for timesheets. So there on the left is an example of a participant checking in. And you might think, well, in the most remote areas, how is that feasible? Well, the digital technologies in this regard are pretty sophisticated now. They can go for up to a month. In fact, although they don't, loading timesheets onto phones and then only uploading it when they get back to Wi-Fi. So the distance and lack of connectivity in certain areas is not a constraint on using this technology for high-level monitoring and evaluation that ensures that we don't have problems such as ghost workers or people not actually on site when they're supposed to be on site. We use a hub and spoke model.
Sorry, Kate.
Yes.
I see you have got 2 minutes left.
Okay, it just went from 5 to 2, but that's fine. I'm nearly done. This is an example. This is just one of the strategic partners. They, in turn, are working with over 100 community-based organizations in the creative arts sector. That's what we mean by a hub and spoke model that is cascading capacities into communities. So we've got geotagged work sites, and I won't go into the detail here. Just to emphasize the entrepreneurial interface here again, is that this is a 2-day-a-week model, but it's ongoing for the full year, and in fact, beyond a year. And the point is that for 2 days a week, people have paid work, but they are supported to engage in complementary livelihood activities in the other days of the week. And we see this as an important model helping people transition into livelihood and enterprise opportunities in a way in which they have income security. All the red arrows point to market-related activities linked to the public employment activities in a context in which this particular program, used as the example, is focusing on food security. The creative sector, over 70,000 people have been supported. This is another example of a sector in which we didn't want to take people out of their gig work, and many people in the sector are in small enterprises. Rather than taking them out of that and putting them in a classic public employment program, we took a different approach, which was to call for proposals from the creative sector to create new work. And through creating new work, employ themselves and others. It's worked fabulously, and the data shows really interesting outcomes. So 42% of respondents said that some of the jobs they created became permanent, which was an outcome that we hadn't entirely anticipated. And the other growth effect is that work was supported. So for example, a theatre production was supported. They were then able to earn ongoing and additional income from showing the work, from tickets, from royalties, from sales. And so we've seen a knock-on multiplier effect from the support to this sector. I'll skip the waste sector and end just by summarizing the growth case. I hope that throughout the presentation you've seen examples of this, but essentially we need to understand that these kinds of programs provide huge support into communities, and that matters in its own right. But there is also a growth case here. There's the social stability case, there's the productivity case. We've spoken about the importance of work experience, how it facilitates labor market entry, how it embeds our investment in skills, and how it's necessary to create a pipeline of successful entrepreneurs. We've seen how the social value that is created can have a growth effect. We see that in relation to the schools. If we can move the dial on learning outcomes, that's a vital constraint on growth at the moment. And the final element that I haven't spoken about is actually in the literature, to which Andrew can attest. In the literature, the stimulus effects of this are also significant. The money spent in local communities and local economies supports the informal sector, small enterprise, and trickles up into the wider economy from there, contributing to jobs in a whole range of value chains. So I'll end there. 0 minutes left, perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Please, a round of applause to Kate. In wrapping up this session, I really liked what came out from Kate's presentation that really highlights that employment is, in as much as it's an economic issue, but it also is a social issue as well. And the impact that employment creation has on communities is quite a factor as well to take into consideration. I know we are running thin on time, but I think it is worthwhile to just hear what our audience has to say, or any questions that they may have for both Kate and Karen. If I can find out from you, Vusi, what's happening online, and perhaps maybe get an indication from the floor if there are any questions or comments for both Kate and Karen. And perhaps whilst that happens, I'm just interested from both yourselves, because I heard a lot of terms being thrown around, work opportunities, placements, FTEs. Maybe if you could just unpack a little what all those terms mean, and if they mean different things for different employment programs.
So I think that the easiest way to answer that is to find a comparator as we're looking at full-time equivalents. So you're going to say if someone was in it, if someone is, well, if you're looking at the program, is knowing that these are not necessarily everyday jobs. If they were, what is the cost over a year? So we can make a projection or look at the spending against a common denominator, because Kate, some of the programs, I think you know 2 days a week for 8 to 10 months is different, so that individuals experience as a work opportunity. Whereas if within the program, 5 of those people, I've got my maths wrong, but is then 5 or 3 or 4 people have the equivalent of work for every day all year. And so then you can start to make measurements or assess like for like.
So it's full-time equivalent. That is the sort of measure that brings all these different terms together.
One way of doing it, yeah.
Okay. And Kate, what
Yeah.
is your take?
No, that's right. I mean, I think a work opportunity is exactly that. It's an opportunity to work. It can be 20 days, which is a pretty short and useless work opportunity. I mean, any work is good, but 20 days is not very long. But so 20 days is a work opportunity, and a year is a work opportunity for one person. And that's why it's important to be able to compare, when you're looking at costs and when you're looking at benefits, to translate the duration into a comparable level. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kate. I see Veli in the distance there. You have a question?
No, it's not a question. It's an appreciation.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Kate, I'm standing here as the beneficiary of that PEP. Like on a very serious note, when I saw it in the program, I was like, okay, I talk a lot and all that, but I really wanted to have this engagement with you, and to say that that program is highly appreciated. It actually, in my story, it changed my life. For instance, I was in the very beginning in 2020 when it started. It started with the teachers with comorbidities, yes. And then I was then I benefited from there up until last year in 2022 on the second phase. With that, I was able to fund my postgraduate certificate in education. I am a qualified teacher for a secondary school, as in when I'm standing here. And also on an academic level, I gained a perspective on the ground issues that are being faced by Department of Education in the secondary schools and all that stuff, especially in the Eastern Cape, in the rural areas and all that perspective. I gained a certain perspective in that body of knowledge as well as in academic. Although, like seriously now, the challenge is now I can't transition to the sustainable labor market, but really, I wanted to say to you, we really appreciate that initiative. This is not my story alone, but there are other people which is the young people that benefited there, that have the similar stories, how they changed their lives around through this program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really quite inspirational to put a face to a program and not just see the numbers. So really great to hear your story. And I'm really happy that there is some impact that some of these programs are having on people. And as I said, in as much as it's an economic an issue, it's also a social issue. So to see that it's impactful is quite inspirational. Thank you so much for that. And Vusi, do you have anything online?
We do have a number of comments and contributions. I think there's Pindo Gutle Mnyaka, who's an economist at the National Treasury. He's saying, in your opinion, or asking rather, in your opinion, what is the real driver of unemployment? Is it that we don't have budget for creating jobs, or is it that we are just struggling to create posts? EPWP, which is the Expanded Public Works Program, workers don't always get permanent jobs after attaining the skills, a concern.
So I think what I'm getting here is a transitioning question. How do we then transition from these work opportunities to full-time placement? Is it a budget issue, or what exactly is the problem here? Kate?
So, can I stand up?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is the conundrum. We need these programs because the economy is not creating employment at the scale of need. But these programs in and of themselves can't solve that problem in the short term. So it's in a sense of a false expectation to say, if you participate in this in the program has only been successful if you can transition into a sustainable job in the wider labor market. The problem is a much bigger one. The problem is an economy-wide problem. We need to see the social provision of employment as actually a necessary part of our employment policy until economic conditions change and pick up, and people can be absorbed into sustainable jobs. So
you can really see how passionate Kate is about some of these programs, and really the impact or the potential impact they can have on the citizens of the country. But I believe we have another question or comment from the floor. Perhaps we can take one more or two more, and then we'll just quickly check into online and probably bring the session to a close. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, and good morning to you, moderator, and to the presenters. Thank you for the presentations. My name is Emmanuel. I've got probably 1.5 questions for you, Kate. I think we heard from the lady, there's a lot of value embedded within the program, the PYEI. But I've got a question about its immediate future. We've had 4 phases of the program, and I think there's been sort of lack of surety around, do we have budgets going forward for this program? Will there be a phase 5, right? And number 2, essentially around the SAU.mobi, right? I think it's given us a database, largely a national database of young people who are there and able and looking for work. Are we seeing support from the private sector now in terms of absorbing some of those young people, some of whom have been skilled as part of the program, PES generally, and are now job ready, like they've learned the skills, they've learned the trade. All they need is just an opportunity to continue with what they've learned. Are we seeing that coming out? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. The reality is that these programs are not funded beyond March 24 at the moment. So this current phase of the schools program is coming to an end, and there is no future funding at present. You will have heard that we have a very dire fiscal framework, and these programs may be cut. They may not be extended. So this is the context that we're in right now. I don't know what the future is. The medium-term budget policy statement in October will tell us. I will be glued to that screen. I hope that you will be too. Will tell us whether there is a future for these programs. I think it's important to recognize these were started as part of an emergency initiative. We've never had, for most of the period, we've only had a 1-year funding timeline of funding security. So all of this has been done helter-skelter with very limited funding timelines, which is suboptimal for planning and for delivering optimal outcomes. The issue you raise about what happens next to people on SAU.mobi and so on, this is the big challenge of our time in terms of employment and unemployment, because the economy is not creating jobs at the scale of need. I'm sure you're familiar with the Youth Employment Service program. It's an excellent program that has brought the private sector in, that incentivizes the private sector to take young people. It is currently placing 20,000 young people a year in the private sector. The schools program alone is placing nearly 250,000 young people each year. The gap between those absorption rates is just horrifying. So we're facing this unemployment crisis is a real crisis that we haven't solved. We need all hands on deck in a sense. We need all the emphasis on sustainable growth is the solution, but it's taking time. So we need alternatives until those remedies come to play. So yes, my answer is unfortunately it's not good news on that front. The labor market is just not absorbing people at the scale of need.
And I guess the fiscal situation also compounds a bit of that. I do know we are running out of time. We have 2 minutes. So in 30 seconds, if you can just wrap up your question, and Kate or Karen, you also have 30 seconds to respond, and perhaps one comment we can take from our online audience, and we can now break for tea. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Senzo Zungu from KZN, Province Department of Social Development. I want to check from government, National Treasury, what is it that the government is doing to assist in job creation? Because we've been talking about the issue that there are no jobs. The economy is not doing well. What is it that we the government is doing to boost the economy, because we cannot always say the economy is not doing well, but the solutions are not clear. What is it that we're trying to boost the economy? What incentives is government giving to companies? Because right now we can see that the government is not in a good position to provide employment. So the alternative is the private sector. Do we have some incentives that we give to the private sector to say, if you're employing so many young people in particular, maybe your tax are going to be reduced by so many percent, so that we can give them incentive and motivate them to assist us in reducing the unemployment. And also regarding the economy, we hear that the issues is around the electricity crisis that we are facing, but we also do not clearly have the solutions, hear about the solutions. What is it that the government is doing to solve that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is a conference on its own. But I will encourage maybe Kate and Karen to quickly respond and maybe pick up on it during our tea break if you want to elaborate a bit further. So Karen, Kate, take
Sure.
this.
Sure. I think you've presented the question that everyone would love an answer to. I think in 30 seconds, I think we must take comfort in the fact that there are people within government who are thinking to try and find these solutions, and it's a continuous conversation, and that it has to be a multi-pronged approach. In the context of this session, public employment programs are trying to have as many positive outcomes through the money that is being spent. And by that, I mean secondary objectives. So one is getting money into people's hands, but then also, where they're possible, additional support, additional skills, and as a grassroots approach in terms of trying to address how, where can we find extra employment. So no easy answer there.
Definitely no easy answer there, but it's something for all of us to start thinking about and seeing which channels and which platforms we can keep pushing some of these conversations and discussions. Very important conversations, very critical questions that are coming forward. And I do think I want the conversation to keep going. Have these conversations over tea, have these conversations over lunch, engage with your colleagues. And hopefully, who knows, maybe some of the answers could come through some of these engagements. But I do want to thank Kate and Karen for the session and the insights and some of the wonderful work that's being done in the public sector around employment creation and alleviating issues of unemployment in the country. And on that, I'd like to bring the session to a close. We will keep engaging with those in the chat. I encourage Karen and Kate to also perhaps respond to some of the questions and comments that are coming in the chat from those joining in online. But to everybody else, I think I'm speaking on behalf of Vusi and Veli by saying we can go on a tea break. I just need confirmation on how long that will be. But
Sure. Sorry. We're gonna go on a just so that the online people can hear. Just waiting for my mic. Is it on? Good. So we're gonna go on a 5 minutes quick a break, and then we'll be back here at exactly at 10 past 11. So online as well, we'll see you at 10 past 11. Thank you.
Thank you.